Awaken your spirit chosen ones. Some people don't come after you because you're weak. They come after you because your existence is an inconvenience to their beliefs. There are battles you don't sign up for, yet they find you anyway. Not loud wars, not dramatic showdowns, but long, calculated attempts to wear you down, confuse your direction, and make you doubt your own footing. This isn't about fantasy or exaggeration. History, psychology, and even workplace studies show a clear pattern. People who grow without permission attract resistance from those who rely on control. Progress without approval is disruptive, and disruption always creates enemies. What makes this story unsettling isn't the presence of opposition, it's the obsession behind it. When someone keeps coming after you long after they should have moved on, it's no longer strategy, it's personal. There's a point where effort stops being logical and starts being revealing, and that's where the truth leaks out. Here's the uncomfortable fact most people don't like to admit. Not every attack is meant to defeat you. Some are meant to validate the attacker. If they can break you, they feel justified. If they can't, they feel exposed. And exposure is far more terrifying than loss. That's why the pressure increases when you stay calm, why the noise gets louder when you stay focused, and why the interference becomes almost comical when you refuse to play along. At some point, you start realizing you're not in danger, you're inconvenient. There's also a strange irony in all of this. The more someone obsesses over taking you down, the more energy they donate to your evolution. While they're busy plotting, you're adapting. While they're rehearsing control, you're mastering restraint. It's like someone trying to push over a wall only to accidentally help reinforce it. Exhausting for them, educational for you. So if you've ever felt targeted in a way that didn't make sense, pressured in ways that felt oddly personal, or opposed by forces that seemed over-invested in your failure, stay right here. This isn't a story about demons being defeated. It's about how obsession collapses when it meets clarity, and how the real victory happens when the war stops having access to you at all. Number one, the obsession wasn't about destroying you, it was about proving you shouldn't exist. Some attacks aren't launched to win, they're launched to erase the evidence that someone like you can exist and still succeed. From the very beginning, the focus was never really on ending you. It was on invalidating you. Your presence alone challenged a belief system that depended on limits, hierarchy, and permission. You moved forward without fitting the expected mold, and that made you a walking contradiction. For someone who built their sense of power on controlling outcomes, that kind of contradiction feels intolerable. What drove the obsession deeper was that you didn't just survive, you continued. You didn't collapse into the role that was silently assigned to you. You didn't shrink, self-destruct, or retreat into apology. Each step you took forward quietly exposed a flaw in their thinking. If you could exist, grow, and stay grounded without following their rules, then maybe their rules were never universal to begin with. And that realization is threatening to anyone whose identity depends on being right. That's why the pressure felt personal. It wasn't random interference. It wasn't bad luck. It was an ongoing attempt to force a conclusion that matched their expectations. They needed you to fail so they could say, "See, that's how it always ends." When you didn't, frustration turned into fixation. Logic gave way to obsession. Instead of reassessing their worldview, they doubled down on attacking the exception. Here's the quiet truth most people miss. When someone becomes obsessed with taking you down, they've already admitted you matter. Not in admiration, but in threat. Your existence questioned something they were afraid to examine, and rather than doing the hard work of self-correction, they chose resistance. The real reason you kept winning wasn't strength or protection. It was legitimacy. You were living proof that their narrative wasn't complete. And no matter how many times they tried to overwrite that fact, reality kept backing you up. That's why the attacks never brought peace. They were never meant to end you. They were meant to silence the truth your life was telling. Number 2, you were targeted because your progress exposed their shortcuts. People don't usually go after someone just for existing. They go after the ones who shine a light on their weaknesses. Your growth wasn't flashy or loud, but it was consistent, real, and undeniable. And that consistency exposed the cracks in the shortcuts others had been relying on for years. While they were trying to cut corners, bend rules, or manipulate outcomes to look successful, you were moving forward the hard way, learning, adapting, and building something that couldn't be faked. That made you a mirror they couldn't ignore, reflecting every gap, every failure, and every compromise they had ever taken to get ahead. That's what drove the obsession. It wasn't just jealousy. It was the panic of someone who suddenly realizes that their entire system of control, efficiency, or superiority is fragile, even fraudulent. Your progress forced them to confront a truth they couldn't accept. Real growth doesn't need approval, shortcuts, or manipulation to succeed. And because your path was visible, it threatened the narrative they'd been selling themselves and others for so long. Every attack, every attempt to push you down was less about you personally and more about their discomfort with being exposed. They wanted to protect their illusion, but the more they tried, the more obvious it became that their methods were nothing compared to your steady advancement. The obsession escalated because no shortcut could outmatch persistence, authenticity, and resilience. And here's the subtle twist. While they were busy trying to take you down, they were showing the world how fragile their own progress was. Every effort to stop you, every manipulation, every act of interference, only highlighted the difference between temporary success, built on cutting corners, and sustainable growth, built on persistence. You weren't just surviving attacks, you were revealing the weaknesses in their system without even trying. And that realization made them desperate, obsessed, and ultimately powerless against someone who simply refused to take the easy way out. Number 3, the attacks increased because you didn't break the way they expected. Most people who launch attacks, whether subtle or overt, have a script in mind. They expect fear, confusion, or a sudden collapse. They expect a moment where you falter, where doubt seeps in, where their influence finally lands. That's why their strategies are so predictable. They rely on human reactions that follow familiar patterns. But you didn't react the way they anticipated. You didn't crumble, panic, or lash out. You didn't feed the script they had rehearsed for months, maybe years. And that shattered their sense of control. The more you stayed composed, the more their attacks escalated. They weren't just testing your limits, they were testing the limits of their own understanding. Every calm response, every measured decision, every silent endurance forced them to invent new tactics on the spot. Obsession thrives on predictability, and when someone defies it, the obsession turns volatile. You didn't break, so they tried harder. You didn't panic, so they intensified. You didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction, so they poured more energy into trying to provoke one. What they failed to see was that their increased aggression wasn't a sign of your weakness. It was a sign of your strength. Every attack they launched that didn't work reinforced your ability to anticipate, adapt, and stay grounded under pressure. Their desperation became your training ground. You began to recognize patterns, spot intentions, and deflect interference almost instinctively. While they were escalating out of frustration, you were learning to move through challenges without giving them leverage. And here's the real twist. The more they tried to force a reaction, the clearer it became to anyone observing that their obsession was irrational. It revealed insecurity dressed up as power, desperation dressed up as strategy. Meanwhile, You were untouchable, not because of luck or protection, but because your composure dismantled the very foundation of their plan. You weren't just surviving, you were rewriting the rules of engagement without ever making a sound. Their intensity became irrelevant the moment you refused to participate in the performance they had designed for you. Number 4, each defeat taught you how their system actually functions. Every time you faced an attack, a trap, or a push meant to break you, it wasn't just a challenge, it was a lesson. While most people see defeat as an endpoint, you experienced it as a window into the machinery behind the attack. Every manipulation, every attempt to destabilize you revealed patterns. You began to understand not just the tactics, but the logic, or the lack of it, that powered them. You learned where the pressure points were, how control was maintained, and which parts of their system relied on fear, distraction, or overconfidence. Each failed attempt to harm you exposed the skeleton of their plan. This knowledge became your secret weapon. You didn't just survive, you collected data in real time. You observed timing, sequences, triggers, and weaknesses. You recognized repetition, the predictable ways they escalated pressure when met with calm resistance. The more you paid attention, the more obvious it became that their attacks weren't infinite. They were formulas. Every formula, once understood, becomes predictable, and predictability gives you power. There's a subtle irony in this. The very attempts meant to end you were the ones that strengthened you. Every time a tactic failed, you gained insight, and insight breeds strategy. You learned to anticipate moves before they happened, to read intent behind words, gestures, and decisions. What others used as fear tactics became a map of their system's limits. You started seeing not chaos, but structure, not aggression, but patterns you could navigate and exploit. By the time the attacks became relentless, they had unknowingly trained you to move through life with an understanding few ever develop. You didn't just build resilience, you built mastery over the forces trying to unseat you. While they believed they were teaching you submission, the truth was that every failure they inflicted revealed the architecture of their own obsession. And in knowing the system better than they did, you held the ultimate advantage, clarity, control, and the unshakable certainty that nothing they threw at you could catch you off guard again. Number 5, they underestimated how quickly awareness becomes armor. Awareness is quiet, subtle, and often overlooked. But it is one of the most powerful forms of protection. The Warlock and their forces assumed that force, deception, and relentless attacks would be enough to weaken you. They didn't account for the fact that once you understood what was happening, their tactics lost their edge. Awareness turned every attempt against you into information. Every manipulation, every scheme, every effort to destabilize you became a clue, a pattern, a guide to moving forward without harm. The moment you recognized the game, you stopped being a participant and became an observer. And observers are almost impossible to defeat. The irony is that they were feeding your armor the entire time. Every attack they launched, every trick they used, sharpened your senses. You started noticing not just what they were doing, but why. You began to recognize the moments designed to provoke panic, to create doubt, and to make you overreact. And as you noticed, the attacks lost their power. Awareness doesn't fight physically, it neutralizes intent. The Warlock's obsession, once terrifying, became almost laughable because their energy was wasted on a target that refused to react in the expected ways. Awareness also gave you freedom. When you knew the boundaries of the threat, you no longer needed to over-prepare or over-protect. You moved with precision instead of paranoia. You could anticipate and sidestep while they burned themselves out, trying to manipulate what they couldn't reach. Every escalation on their part became a sign that you were winning in the quietest, most unstoppable way. In the end, awareness was your invisible shield. While others rely on force, speed, or intimidation, you relied on understanding, perception, and clarity. And the most dangerous thing for someone obsessed with control is not defiance or resistance, it's comprehension. Once you saw through the chaos, you became untouchable, not because of strength or luck, but because knowing the game made you immune to it. And nothing frustrates an obsessed opponent more than realizing their every effort is irrelevant against someone who simply sees clearly. Number 6, you stopped feeding the fight with emotional reactions. One of the most powerful tools the Warlock relied on was your reaction. Every attack, every manipulation, every attempt to provoke you was designed to elicit fear, anger, or confusion. They thrived on the energy your emotions created because obsession feeds on participation. The moment you stopped giving it to them, the entire dynamic shifted. You didn't respond with panic or rage. You didn't argue, defend, or justify. You simply refused to play the part they had scripted. And that refusal was more devastating than any direct confrontation could have been. Emotion is currency in battles like this. And once you stopped spending it, their resources dwindled. Every plan that relied on your frustration, doubt, or despair suddenly became useless. They escalated, tried harder, but it didn't matter because the reactions they sought were gone. Calmness, clarity, and detachment turned into invisible armor. You weren't ignoring the attacks. You were absorbing them without granting them power. That alone forced the Warlock to overextend, to reveal desperation, and to make mistakes they couldn't recover from. The beauty of this is subtle. By refusing to react, you turned their aggression into wasted effort. While they were counting on your fear or confusion, you were observing, analyzing, and strengthening. Every attempt to provoke became a lesson in their methods and a chance for you to refine your response. What was meant to weaken you ended up sharpening your understanding, your resilience, and your strategy. Eventually, the obsession itself began to implode. Without your participation, their fixation became unproductive. They were no longer controlling a battle. They were flailing at someone who had already moved beyond the fight. Your silence, patience, and emotional discipline became the most powerful weapon at your disposal. The Warlock might have expected a reaction, but instead, they encountered a force they couldn't manipulate, a presence that simply existed on its own terms. And in that space, the fight lost all meaning, because the only thing they could control, the energy you gave them, was no longer available. Number 7, your growth forced their demons into the open. There's a certain kind of power in simply existing, in moving forward with clarity and determination, that exposes what's hidden. The Warlock's demons thrived in secrecy, in the shadows where they could operate without observation. They relied on hidden threats, manipulations you couldn't see coming, and pressure you weren't aware of until it landed. But your growth, steady, undeniable, and uncompromising, acted like a spotlight. It forced these hidden forces into visibility. The more you advanced, the less room there was for their secrets to remain effective. Every step forward revealed patterns, strategies, and weaknesses they had counted on remaining hidden. This is why obsession became more desperate. Once their methods were visible, they lost the advantage of surprise, intimidation, and control. The demons, once lurking in the background, had to confront someone who could see them clearly. They were no longer ghosts that haunted from afar. They were entities whose every move could be tracked, anticipated, and neutralized. Growth, in this sense, is a form of revelation. It doesn't just protect you, it exposes the architecture of the forces trying to suppress you. There's also a psychological effect on the Warlock. The more you revealed without intending to, the more frantic their responses became. They couldn't hide behind the familiar cloak of intimidation because your clarity didn't allow it. Every attack, every manipulation, every attempt to undermine you was now visible, and that visibility stripped away their subtlety. They were forced into reactive moves, mistakes, and patterns that you could analyze and outmaneuver. Your growth didn't just shield you, it dismantled the foundation of their power. The demon's advantage depended on secrecy, misdirection, and your unawareness. By refusing to shrink, by refusing to hide, you turned exposure into your ally. The forces that once seemed untouchable were now vulnerable to observation, strategy, and discipline. In the end, it wasn't brute force or luck that defeated them. It was the quiet, relentless fact that your evolution brought everything into the open, leaving them scrambling in the light of your clarity. Number 8. You learned that endurance outlasts aggression every time. There's a truth most people never fully grasp. Aggression is loud, intense, and exhausting, but it is temporary. Endurance, on the other hand, is quiet, steady, and unstoppable. The Warlock relied on bursts of attack, on rapid escalation, on chaos meant to overwhelm you. Their expectation was simple. Eventually, the pressure would break you. But what they didn't account for was your ability to endure. Every attempt to destabilize you collided with your patience, your clarity, and your refusal to succumb to panic. Aggression burns out quickly, but endurance doesn't. Endurance isn't passive. It's an active form of strength. You observed, adapted, and persisted while they were expending energy, chasing reactions, and trying to maintain control. The longer the battle dragged on, the more their intensity became a liability. Each attack they launched demanded energy, creativity, and focus, while your approach required none of that frantic energy. They were fighting for nothing while you were simply moving forward. That contrast eventually became unbearable for them. Aggression without return is not power, it's wasted effort. What makes endurance even more dangerous to an obsessed adversary is its predictability and stability. They couldn't outpace it, outsmart it, or exhaust it. No matter how relentless their attacks became, your calm persistence remained unshakable. Each attempt to provoke fear, doubt, or anger failed. Each attempt to break you only highlighted their diminishing control. In essence, your endurance turned their aggression against them. Every wasted effort, every failed tactic, every escalation only revealed the limits of their own power while reinforcing your own. Ultimately, endurance wins because it doesn't require spectacle, strategy, or ego. It simply outlasts the noise, the chaos, and the obsession. While they burned themselves out trying to provoke, manipulate, and control, you continued to move with intention and clarity. Aggression may make noise, but endurance makes history. By refusing to be shaken, you didn't just survive. You demonstrated a truth they could never match. Consistency, calm, and perseverance are forces that no intensity, obsession, or attack can ever defeat. Number 9. Your victories were quiet, which made them unbearable to watch. The most unsettling victories are often the silent ones. You didn't make a spectacle of your progress. You didn't shout, boast, or demand attention. Every success was subtle, measured, and undeniable. It was the kind of victory that seeps into reality without fanfare, the kind that grows while others are busy trying to manipulate, control, or intimidate. And that silence, the absence of dramatic confrontation, was what made your triumphs unbearable to the Warlock. They couldn't frame your wins as luck or a fluke, and they couldn't discredit your effort because it was steady, undeniable, and self-sustaining. The frustration of watching someone succeed quietly is corrosive. While the Warlock expected chaos, breakdowns, and emotional displays, you delivered calm, deliberate progress. Each step you took forward wasn't a clash. It was proof that the fight they waged wasn't necessary to define you. Their obsession was built on the hope that your victories would be loud, that they could claim them back or diminish them with theatrics. But your calm undermined that hope. Every small success, every personal milestone, every quiet moment of mastery became a mirror, reflecting not just your strength, but their own desperation. There's a particular kind of torment in watching someone advance without being provoked, without losing control, without becoming the story of your obsession. Your wins didn't require drama. They required consistency, focus, and clarity, things they couldn't replicate no matter how hard they tried. Each silent victory stripped them of their leverage, made their attacks feel irrelevant, and highlighted the futility of their obsession. Ultimately, your quiet triumphs were more than victories. They were a statement. They proved that power doesn't need spectacle, control doesn't need noise, and obsession cannot outlast calm determination. While they were burning energy to provoke a reaction, you were simply moving forward, growing and existing on your own terms. That is a kind of victory that not only succeeds, but also humiliates without saying a word. And for anyone consumed by control, there's nothing more unbearable than watching truth unfold silently, unstoppable and undeniable. Number 10. You broke the illusion that power requires cruelty. For those obsessed with control, the world operates on a simple equation. Power equals domination, influence equals intimidation, and success comes at someone else's expense. The Warlock believed that maintaining authority meant instilling fear, manipulating outcomes, and forcing compliance. That's how their system functioned, and that's why they expected you to bend, break, or retaliate. What they didn't anticipate was that your power didn't depend on cruelty. Your strength wasn't measured by the damage you could inflict or the fear you could provoke. It was measured by how steadily, calmly, and intelligently you moved through life, regardless of the attacks aimed at you. This realization was quietly devastating to them. Every act of manipulation, every attempt to provoke a reaction failed because your authority didn't come from aggression. It came from understanding, discipline, and clarity. By refusing to engage in the same destructive games they relied on, you demonstrated a truth they couldn't accept. True power doesn't need to harm others, it doesn't need to intimidate, and it doesn't need to dominate. It exists naturally, effortlessly, and with resilience that cruelty can never match. Their obsession escalated because they couldn't comprehend this model. They had built their identity around the idea that dominance was the only path to influence. When you refused to follow that path, yet continued to succeed, it undermined the very foundation of their worldview. You weren't trying to prove anything, but your existence proved everything. That control built on fear is fragile, while strength built on principle is enduring. And here's the subtle brilliance of it all. Your approach didn't just shield you from attacks, it reshaped the battlefield. By breaking their illusion, you exposed the limits of their power, making every attempt to challenge you not only futile, but transparent. While they relied on cruelty, you relied on presence, discipline, and quiet confidence. That difference wasn't just a tactic, it was a revelation. It forced them to face a reality they had never anticipated, that true influence doesn't come from hurting others. It comes from mastering yourself, and in doing so, becoming untouchable in a way cruelty can never achieve. Number 11. They couldn't predict you because you weren't driven by ego. Most people operate on predictable patterns because ego guides their decisions. Ego demands recognition, approval, and validation, and it reacts in ways that can be anticipated. The Warlock expected that every attack, every manipulation, every attempt to destabilize you would trigger a predictable response: fear, anger, defensiveness, or desperation. That's how they structured their obsession, how they timed their assaults, and how they measured their own sense of control. What they didn't count on was that your actions weren't fueled by ego. You weren't performing for approval, defending your image, or seeking to prove yourself. You were simply acting with purpose, clarity, and focus. That made you unpredictable, untraceable, and untouchable. Without ego to manipulate, their usual levers of control were useless. They couldn't provoke a reaction because there was no vanity to exploit, no insecurity to trigger. Every effort they made to anticipate your moves failed because you weren't operating from fear of judgment or desire for recognition. Your decisions were calculated, grounded in reality, and free from the distortions that cloud perception. In their eyes, unpredictability is chaos, but for you, it was freedom. The very thing that made them obsessed, the inability to control or predict your response, was your greatest strength. Their frustration escalated as they tried harder, pushing boundaries, testing limits, and inventing strategies that assumed ego-driven reactions. Every failure to provoke the expected response chipped away at their confidence and exposed the flaws in their obsession. Meanwhile, you moved with precision, using calm, rational judgment to navigate attacks. Every attempt to corner you only highlighted the difference between ego-driven desperation and purpose-driven resilience. Ultimately, the reason they couldn't predict you wasn't luck. It wasn't secrecy or protection. It was the absence of ego. By acting from intent rather than pride, from clarity rather than vanity, you became immune to manipulation. Their obsession, their intensity, and their aggression could not map onto someone who operated beyond ego, and in that space you achieved the kind of power that is impossible to challenge, control, or anticipate. Number 12. Every failed attack weakened their belief in their own mastery. The Warlock's obsession thrived on confidence, the kind built on control, manipulation, and the certainty that they could bend circumstances to their will. Every plan, every scheme, every subtle attempt to undermine you was executed with the belief that it would succeed. Their power depended on mastery, on the unshakable notion that their strategies were flawless and their influence absolute. But every time you resisted, every time you remained unshaken, every time you turned their attacks into lessons rather than setbacks, that belief began to crumble. What they failed to recognize is that confidence rooted in domination is fragile. It thrives only when results align with expectations. When you refused to play the role they had scripted, when you defied the outcomes they predicted, it introduced a new variable into their system: uncertainty. That uncertainty spread like a crack through the foundation of their control. The more they tried, the more obvious it became that mastery wasn't absolute. Their confidence, once steady and imposing, wavered under the pressure of repeated failure. And here's the critical point. Their obsession became self-defeating. Every attack meant to prove dominance, instead highlighted incompetence. Every attempt to manipulate you exposed their inability to predict, control, or influence your actions. While they were focused on proving power, the failures built quietly, cumulatively, like erosion undermining a cliff. What they thought was mastery was revealed as fragile, reactive, and ultimately powerless against someone who operated with purpose and clarity rather than fear or ego. In the end, their belief in control was hollow. The obsession that drove them forward, the need to prove superiority, to manipulate outcomes, to dominate, backfired. Each failed attempt didn't just leave you standing, it chipped away at the illusion of their power. By refusing to succumb, you didn't merely survive attacks, you dismantled the foundation of their confidence. Every failure on their part strengthened your position, while simultaneously exposing the fragility of theirs. In that space, mastery was no longer theirs, and obsession, once a weapon, became a mirror reflecting their own vulnerability. Number 13. You survived long enough to outgrow the battlefield. There's a point in every prolonged struggle when endurance transforms into transcendence. The Warlock and their forces believed the battle was about confrontation, that the objective was to break you within a set of rules, limits, or timelines. They measured success by immediate impact, by visible collapse, by the kind of reaction that confirms control. But you didn't play by their timetable. You moved at your own pace, learning, adapting, and persisting until the rules of the battlefield no longer applied. Survival wasn't about resisting moment by moment. It was about outlasting the relevance of the fight itself. By staying steady, by refusing to be distracted or provoked, you changed the nature of the struggle. What once seemed urgent and threatening gradually lost its grip. Every attack, every attempt to destabilize you, added to your knowledge and resilience, rather than diminishing it. You didn't just withstand the pressure, you transformed it into experience, insight, and clarity. The battlefield that was meant to contain you became a training ground, a stage for growth, and eventually, a place you outgrew. There's an invisible shift that happens when someone outgrows the conflict. The aggressor loses purpose. The Warlock's obsession depended on the idea that you were accessible, that their actions could influence, manipulate, or intimidate you. But when you evolved beyond their reach, the dynamic inverted. Their attacks became meaningless, their manipulations irrelevant, and their fixation hollow. Survival was no longer just a defense, it was a liberation. The real power of this moment is subtle but absolute. Outgrowing the battlefield isn't about annihilating opposition or proving dominance. It's about moving beyond the scope of influence and obsession. It's about reaching a state where the energy spent against you no longer matters because you exist outside the parameters of their war. By surviving, learning, and evolving, you didn't just win, you rendered the battle obsolete. The war ended not because it was fought to completion, but because you were no longer in the arena they thought contained you. And in that absence, ultimate freedom and victory quietly claimed their place. Number 14. The obsession ended when they realized you were no longer available to conquer. Obsession thrives on access. It survives on the idea that the target can be reached, influenced, or controlled. The Warlock believed that no matter how resilient or clever you were, there would always be a point where they could assert dominance. Every plan, every manipulation, every attack was rooted in the expectation that you were within their grasp. But the truth is, power isn't about how hard someone attacks. It's about who remains untouchable. The moment they realized you could no longer be reached, that their strategies no longer mattered, their obsession lost its fuel. You weren't defeated, distracted, or hidden. You simply moved beyond the scope of their influence. All the tactics meant to provoke fear, doubt, or reaction fell flat because they no longer had access to your energy, your focus, or your response. Their fixation, once intense and relentless, became hollow. The desperation that had driven their attacks now reflected their own limits rather than your vulnerabilities. They could no longer project control, manipulate outcomes, or feed their sense of superiority, and that realization was unbearable. Being unavailable to them didn't require dramatic gestures or displays of power. It was subtle, quiet, and absolute. You existed beyond the arena they thought contained you, operating from clarity, focus, and autonomy. Their obsession was not destroyed by confrontation. It was neutralized by absence. Without your participation, their energy was wasted, their purpose collapsed, and their fixation turned inward, exposing the fragility of their own need to dominate. The ultimate victory lies in this refusal of access. By existing on your own terms, unshaken and independent, you didn't just survive, you disarmed the very thing that sought to control you. Obsession dies when it meets someone who cannot be reached, and in that space, freedom is absolute. The Warlock's energy, their intensity, and their strategies became irrelevant because the one thing they depended on, you, was no longer within reach. In that quiet absence, the war ended, and victory was not taken. It was simply claimed by existing beyond their grasp. The story of facing relentless obsession is not one of brute force or dramatic confrontation. It's a story of clarity, endurance, and quiet mastery. Every attack you survived, every manipulation you saw through, and every attempt to provoke you only strengthened your presence. You turned aggression into insight, chaos into understanding, and fixation into fuel for your growth. While others measured power by domination, intimidation, or control, you proved that true strength comes from purpose, calm, and the refusal to participate in the games of obsession. Your victories were subtle but profound. Your endurance outlasted every attack, and your awareness became an invisible shield no strategy could penetrate. You exposed the flaws in their systems, shattered their illusions of control, and ultimately made the battlefield irrelevant simply by existing beyond its scope. In doing so, you didn't just survive, you transcended, showing that power is not taken through fear or cruelty, but claimed through mastery over self and clarity of vision. The forces obsessed with breaking you discovered the hard truth. The stronger you grow, the weaker their control becomes, and the more untouchable you truly are. This is more than a story of surviving attacks. It's a blueprint for anyone navigating forces that seek to undermine, control, or intimidate. It's a reminder that calmness, consistency, and clarity are more potent than any form of aggression, and that the ultimate victory lies not in defeating others, but in moving beyond their reach. If you found this journey compelling, inspiring, or eye-opening, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more insights that reveal the hidden truths behind influence, power, and resilience. Don't forget to like this video if it resonated with you. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts and share it with someone who needs to see that true strength isn't about fighting harder, it's about rising higher. Stay awakened, chosen ones.